never thought I'd end up in a job like this. Grave digging. The thought alone used to send chills down my spine when I was younger. The idea of working among the dead, of spending hours in a cemetery surrounded by headstones, shrouded in fog and silence, it seemed like something out of a nightmare. But here I was, applying for the position. It all started when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and the pace of life is slow. I had come here to escape the chaos of city living, hoping for some peace, but the transition wasn't as smooth as I had hoped. The job market was tight, and despite applying everywhere, I couldn't land anything decent. One morning, as I was sitting in the small diner where I'd taken to getting my coffee every day, I saw a help wanted sign on the bulletin board. It was handwritten in thick black ink. Grave digger needed. Apply at the cemetery. Immediate start. It seemed like the kind of job that no one else would want, but the pay was decent, and at that point, I was willing to do just about anything. So, with nothing left to lose, I grabbed the number and called. A gruff voice answered the phone on the second ring. "This is old Thomas," he said. "You looking to work here?" "Yeah, I saw the sign. I'm interested in the gravedigger position," I replied. He chuckled, a deep, raspy sound that made me hesitate. "You sure about that? It's not for everyone, it's hard work and it can get lonely." "I'm up for it. I need the work," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't say much after that, just told me to show up the next day and report to the cemetery by 8 a.m. sharp. No questions asked, just get to work. The whole thing felt strange, like there was some unspoken rule about this job that I didn't quite understand. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. The next day, I showed up at the cemetery just as instructed. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows over the grounds. The cemetery itself was old, with crumbling headstones and a few mausoleums tucked in the back corners. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the quiet was almost oppressive, as though the land itself was holding its breath. I walked through the iron gates and toward the small maintenance shed where I had been told to report. Inside, I found old Thomas, a man in his mid-60s with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore a faded brown work shirt and a cap that looked like it had seen better days. His hands were thick and calloused, the kind of hands that had spent a lifetime working the land. "You're here for the job, huh?" he asked, his voice rough. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm here." Thomas didn't say much after that. He handed me a shovel, gave me a short nod, and then led me to the back of the cemetery. It felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare, walking through rows of graves, most of them old and weathered. The graves were in disarray, some sunken, others overgrown with weeds, and the whole place had an eerie feeling to it, as if something was just waiting beneath the surface. I didn't know much about grave digging, but old Thomas showed me the basics: where to dig, how deep, and the proper way to set the headstone. It wasn't complicated, but it was hard work. The soil was thick, heavy, and the shovel seemed to bite into the earth with resistance every time I plunged it in. But it was the kind of labor that made you feel grounded, connected to something larger than yourself. As the morning wore on, I started to get used to the rhythm, but there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the trees lined the cemetery, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, or how quiet it was. Too quiet. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving between the graves. At lunch, old Thomas took a seat on a nearby bench, chewing on an apple, his eyes never leaving the work at hand. He had been quiet all morning, only speaking when absolutely necessary. But as I wiped the sweat from my brow, I decided to ask him. "Why does it feel so strange here?" I asked, unsure of how to phrase it. Thomas didn't look at me at first. He just kept staring out at the rows of graves, his face expressionless. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low. "People come and go. Some leave and some stay," he said cryptically before standing up and dusting off his pants. "Come on, kid. Time to get back to work." I didn't understand what he meant by that, but I could feel my unease growing. There was something more to this place, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. But I didn't press him for more. I didn't want to seem too curious, not yet. I had just started, and I had a job to do. But as the sun began to set, and the shadows stretched longer over the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. The next few days followed the same pattern. I would show up at the cemetery early in the morning, shovel in hand, and old Thomas would point me to a grave that needed attention. At first, it was just routine. Digging, filling, cleaning up after the job was done. The work was exhausting but simple, and for the first time in a while I felt like I was doing something meaningful, helping the departed find their final rest, even if that meant enduring the eerie silence of the cemetery. But the longer I worked, the more the unease settled in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were little things that didn't add up. The way the trees surrounding the cemetery seemed to whisper when the wind wasn't blowing, or how the ground beneath my feet sometimes felt softer than it should, almost as though it were shifting on its own. The graves themselves, too. Some were newer, others ancient, but there was one grave in particular that drew my attention. A large, weather-worn plot at the far end of the cemetery. Its headstone was cracked, the name barely legible, but what bothered me wasn't the condition of the stone. It was the way the grave seemed wrong. It was sunken, much deeper than the others, and the soil around it was always disturbed. I had noticed this every day, but old Thomas never seemed to pay it any attention. He avoided it, in fact, steering me away when we were near. "Don't bother with that one," he'd say gruffly, his voice taking on a tone that was too sharp for comfort. "It's been like that for years. Just leave it be." But the more he told me to leave it alone, the more I wanted to dig. I didn't know why, but something about that grave felt different, as though it had a story waiting to be told. I kept my distance, but my curiosity gnawed at me. Something about it was calling to me, urging me to uncover the secret buried there. It wasn't until the 5th day that I finally broke. Old Thomas had left for lunch, leaving me to handle the work on my own. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and the air was thick with humidity. The distant hum of bees and the nearby flowers was the only sound, but everything else was still. Too still. I knew this was my chance, the moment I had been waiting for. I grabbed my shovel and made my way toward the grave. It was a little farther out than the others, and the silence around it felt suffocating. Every step I took toward it felt heavier, like the ground itself was resisting me. When I reached the edge of the grave, I hesitated, looking around to make sure no one was watching. I didn't want old Thomas to find out. He'd been clear enough in his warnings, but I couldn't stop myself. I began to dig, slowly at first, taking careful, deliberate shovelfuls of earth. The ground felt softer here than anywhere else, almost spongy. As I dug deeper, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wiped sweat from my brow, but the cold didn't subside. In fact, it only seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a thick fog. Something wasn't right. I kept digging, my hands shaking now, but I couldn't stop. The sound of my shovel scraping against the dirt was almost deafening in the silence. I could feel the earth giving way beneath me, and then, suddenly, the shovel struck something hard. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I cleared away the dirt carefully, my hands trembling. I could see the edge of something that didn't belong. It was a wooden box, old, weathered, and almost completely decayed. But there was no mistaking it. It was a coffin. My breath caught in my throat. Why was there a coffin here, so deep beneath the earth, when the grave had looked so normal from the outside? Something was off about this entire situation. I cleared away the last bit of dirt, and as I reached down to touch the lid, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery. It was strange, cold, almost unnatural, and the air seemed to buzz with static, like the very atmosphere was charged. I pulled back for a moment, my heart racing in my chest. The silence that followed the wind was oppressive, deafening. I reached for the coffin again, and with a deep breath, I lifted the lid. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The coffin was empty, completely empty, except for a single object resting in the center. A small, black stone, smooth and round, as though it had been polished by centuries of wear. But what was more disturbing was the faint glow it emitted. It wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable. The stone pulsed with a dim light, like it was alive, like it was waiting. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed against the stone, a shock of cold ran through me. My vision blurred for a moment, and I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I heard a distant, low rumble, like something deep within the earth was awakening. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The stone was not just a relic, it was something far darker, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for someone to find it. The wind picked up again, this time stronger, and I could hear it. Whispers, faint at first but growing louder. The voices seemed to echo through the trees, through the ground beneath me. They weren't just whispers. They were commands, beckoning me. Leave it. I spun around, but no one was there. The voices were growing louder, more insistent, and I could feel them in my chest, in my bones. Something was calling to me from beneath the earth. The stone, the grave. It was all connected. And then, in the distance, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I slowly turned to face the source of the sound. The grave I had been digging lay open in front of me, its depths filled with the eerie glow of the stone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was approaching. The air was thick with tension, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, but they didn't sound like they were coming from anywhere nearby. They echoed through the cemetery, their sound reverberating off the gravestones and trees that surrounded me. It was as if they were coming from the earth itself. I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble slightly, as if something ancient and powerful was stirring beneath the soil. I looked around, expecting to see someone, old Thomas maybe, or a passerby, but there was no one. The cemetery was empty, save for the graves and the shadows that stretched long across the ground as the sun began to set. The sky was darkening quickly, the air turning colder with each passing moment. I took a step back from the open grave, my gaze darting nervously across the cemetery. The footsteps continued, closer now, but still I saw no one. It felt as though the cemetery itself was alive, its dead inhabitants stirring in their graves, watching me, waiting. I stumbled back, my breath shallow as I fumbled for the shovel I had dropped earlier. The handle was slick with sweat, my hands trembling as I gripped it tightly, using it to steady myself. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever was approaching found me. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The stone, the black stone that had been resting in the coffin, was glowing brighter now, pulsing with an unnatural light. The air around it shimmered, as though the very atmosphere was warping under its influence. My stomach churned as I stared at it. It wasn't just a relic. It wasn't just some forgotten artifact buried in the earth. It was something else, something ancient, something dark, and it was calling to me. I couldn't look away. My feet felt rooted to the ground as if the stone itself had a hold on me, pulling me toward it. The whispers, which had been faint at first, grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just a hum in the background. They were clear, resonating in my mind, urging me forward. Take it. The voice was deep, hollow, and echoing, like it came from the very depths of the earth. It wasn't a command. It was a compulsion, a need that filled me, urging me to reach for the stone. I didn't want to. My mind screamed at me to resist, to run, to get away, but my hand moved of its own accord, trembling as I reached for the stone. The moment my fingers made contact with its surface, a shock of cold ran through me, as though I had touched something alive, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The world around me seemed to shift. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as though it was shifting, warping, and the cemetery itself seemed to bend and stretch. The sky above darkened, swirling with ominous clouds, and the wind began to howl, rushing through the trees and the graves, carrying with it the scent of something rotten, something decayed. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The stone had already latched onto me, its power filling me, draining me, like it was feeding off my fear. I could feel it inside me now, its presence filling my chest, my mind, taking over. And then I heard it, a voice, not in my head, but behind me. You shouldn't have done that. I spun around, my heart racing, but no one was there. The cemetery was still empty, the graves standing silently in the twilight. But the voice, it was real. It had been real. I could feel the weight of it, the oppressive pressure that surrounded me. And then I saw them, the guests. They weren't just in the cemetery. They were standing, walking, their bodies shifting between the gravestones like they were part of the very land itself. Their eyes were empty, hollow, like they had been pulled from the grave to witness whatever had just been unleashed. Some of them were walking toward me, their movements slow, unnatural, as though they were being controlled by some unseen force. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I realized what was happening. The stone, it wasn't just a relic, it was a key to something ancient, something dark that had been waiting beneath the earth for centuries, and now it had been awakened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until the ground beneath me began to shake. I could feel the earth rumbling, as if the very cemetery was coming alive, shifting and shifting beneath my feet. I turned to run, but before I could move, a hand reached out from the shadows, grabbing my arm. I screamed, but the hand held tight, pulling me toward the gravestones. I twisted and fought, trying to break free, but the grip was unyielding. The figures, no, the ghosts, were all around me now, their eyes fixed on me, their cold fingers digging into my skin. "You've awakened it." The voice was different now, deeper, older. It was the voice of something that had never died, something that had been buried with the dead. And now it was awake. It was free. I struggled, but the figures kept coming. The grave I had dug, the stone I had touched, it was all part of something larger, something much more sinister than I had ever imagined. The guests, the souls who had never checked out, were not the only ones trapped here. And now, neither was I. The hand on my arm tightened, pulling me closer to the graveyard's center, where the soil seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The figures, the guests, the spirits who had never checked out, surrounded me now, their eyes hollow, their forms hazy but solid enough to touch. Each one of them reached out, their cold, bony fingers brushing against my skin, sending shockwaves of icy fear through my body. I struggled against their grip, my muscles screaming in protest, but they wouldn't let go. The cemetery, once a place of quiet repose, now felt alive, as if it was a living entity, breathing beneath me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, softening like mud, as though the very earth itself was turning to liquid. "What is this?" I gasped, my voice breaking as I tried to free myself from their hold. "What's happening?" One of the figures, a man dressed in tattered clothes and with skin that seemed to melt away from his bones, stepped forward. His eyes were black pits, like deep, empty wells. He reached out with both hands, and his voice, cold, hollow, echoed in my mind, reverberating like 1,000 whispers. "You've disturbed the rest." I recoiled from him, my breath shallow as his words sank in. The grave I had been digging, the stone I had touched. It wasn't just a relic, it wasn't just a curse, it was a link, a tether to something far worse, something that had been buried here, hidden beneath layers of dirt and time, waiting for someone like me to awaken it. And I had awakened it. The ground beneath me trembled again, a deep, resonant hum that filled the air and vibrated through my bones. The figures began to move around me in slow, deliberate circles, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Their voices rose together in unison, like an incantation that tied the air to the earth itself. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice hoarse with terror. "I didn't mean to." The man stepped closer, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of decay, of earth and rot, and his eyes locked onto mine, empty and infinite. "It's too late." Before I could react, he shoved me toward the center of the cemetery, where the earth seemed to rise and fall like it was breathing. I fell to my knees, my hands scraping against the dirt. I could feel the vibrations under the ground growing stronger, and the whispers of the long dead grew louder in my ears. Something was coming. I didn't understand what I had unearthed, what I had disturbed, but I could feel it now, the ancient force stirring beneath the cemetery, stretching, waking. It wasn't just the spirits of the dead that were here. There was something darker, something older, something that had been buried with them. A presence, ancient and evil, and it was breaking free. The ground beneath me cracked open, and with a deep, grinding sound, a mass of black, shifting tendrils erupted from the earth. It was like a living thing, writhing and coiling, pushing its way through the dirt as if it had been asleep for centuries. The air turned thick with the stench of decay, and I felt my body freeze in terror. I tried to scream, but no sound came. my breath hitched in my chest as the tendrils reached up from the earth, curling around the gravestones, pulling the soil away like a blanket being lifted from a bed. They were everywhere, winding and spiraling through the cemetery, their blackness suffocating the light. I could hear whispers now, louder than ever, voices, laughter, and screams all blending into one terrible cacophony. The ground gave way beneath me and I fell into the shifting mass of blackness. I tried to claw my way out, but the tendrils were too strong. They wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. My body trembled, the cold seeping into my very bones. The voices filled my mind, growing louder and more frantic. "You've awakened the cursed." The words echoed through the endless darkness, and I felt them pierce my soul. There was no escape. The dead were no longer just ghosts. They were alive, alive in the way that something unholy can be. And the grave I had opened, what I had disturbed, was just the beginning. I thought of old Thomas, the way he had spoken in riddles, the way he avoided the grave I had uncovered. I thought of his warning. I had thought it was just superstition. But now I understood. The guests, those who never checked out, weren't trapped in this cemetery by chance. They were here because they were bound to it, because they had awakened something darker than death itself. I could feel it now. The earth around me pulsed, and the air hummed with the energy of whatever ancient being had been buried here so long ago. The voices that surrounded me weren't just whispers. They were commands, demands, beckoning me to join them. And then I saw it. A figure rising from the center of the cemetery, rising from the black tendrils. It was taller than the others, its face hidden beneath a hood of shadow, but its presence filled the space, like the very essence of darkness itself. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. "You've disturbed the resting place of the cursed." The figure spoke with a voice like thunder, and I knew in that moment that there was no turning back. Whatever was rising from the earth was ancient, and I had unleashed it. I was now a part of this place, bound to it, like the others who had never checked out. I had awakened something that would never be put back to rest. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me. I tried to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as the darkness closed in around me. And just before the light vanished completely, I heard the final whisper. "You belong here. Forever." The darkness consumed me. The last thing I remember was the cold touch of the figure's hand. Like ice, like death itself, had reached out and pulled me into its grasp. And then, everything went black. I woke up in the same place, but it wasn't the same. The cemetery, the graves, the sky, all were unchanged. But the air was different, heavier, thicker. It felt like the ground was breathing beneath me, the earth itself shifting with some ancient, unknowable power. The air was suffocating, as though the cemetery had become alive, its very bones moving and groaning under the weight of the curse that had been unleashed. I sat up, my body stiff, aching. My hands trembled as I placed them on the ground, and it was then I realized something terrible. I could feel the pulse of the earth beneath me. It wasn't just the ground. It was the cemetery. It was alive. The voices were back. They whispered in my ears, seeping into my thoughts, filling my head with their demands. I wanted to scream, to push them away, but the more I tried, the louder they became. The dead were speaking, and their words were too powerful, too overwhelming. "You're one of us now." I stumbled to my feet, my vision blurry as I looked around. The cemetery was unchanged, the gravestones standing tall in the moonlight. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air felt cold and thick. But there was something different about it now, something that I couldn't put into words. And then I saw them again, the guests. They were no longer just the hollow, ghostly figures I had seen before. They were real now, their forms solid, like they had risen from the earth itself. Their eyes were still empty, still lifeless, but their movements were different. They walked toward me, slowly, deliberately, their footsteps echoing in the silence, and behind them, the dark figure, the one who had spoken to me, the one who had pulled me into this nightmare, loomed like a shadow, its presence filling the cemetery. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the procession of the dead. They were surrounding me, their cold, dead hands reaching out for me. "Join us." The voice echoed again, and this time I felt it deep within me. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command, a compulsion, pulling me closer to the center of the cemetery, toward the grave I had disturbed. My legs moved against my will. I tried to fight, but the force that controlled me was stronger than any fear I could muster. I couldn't stop myself. I was being dragged toward that cursed grave, pulled into its depths by some unseen force. When I reached the grave, the earth seemed to tremble beneath my feet. The stone I had unearthed, black and glowing with an otherworldly light, was now pulsing like a heartbeat. The shadows surrounding the grave seemed to bend and twist, forming shapes that I couldn't comprehend. The wind howled, and the air grew colder. "You belong to us now." The voice was louder this time, as though the very ground itself was speaking to me. The figure, the one that had risen from the earth, stepped forward, its dark eyes fixed on me. The cycle is complete. The dead will never rest. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't come. The earth beneath me seemed to reach up, wrapping around my feet, pulling me into the soil. The whispers surrounded me, filling my head with their demands, their commands. They were speaking to me and I was listening. I couldn't help it. "You are bound to this place." The words filled my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. The figure moved closer, its cold, dead hand reaching out for me. It placed its hand on my shoulder, and for a moment I felt the weight of the cemetery, the weight of the souls trapped here, pressed down on me. The voices grew louder, their cries and whispers drowning out everything else. "You are one of us." The ground beneath me began to rumble, and I felt the earth shift again. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was part of the cemetery now, part of its dark, cursed soul. I was bound to it. The dead were no longer separate from me. They were inside me. I was inside them. The figure stepped back, and for the first time I realized what it meant. What had happened. I had become a part of the cemetery. The guests, the spirits who had never checked out, they were me now. Their bodies, their souls, were bound to the earth, and so was mine. I had opened the grave. I had unleashed the curse that had been waiting, buried beneath the soil for centuries. And now, I was one of the dead. The whispers stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, rooted in place, as the earth continued to pulse beneath me. The cemetery was alive, and I was a part of it. The dead were no longer ghosts. They were a part of me, and I was a part of them. The moment the whispers ceased, an eerie silence settled over the cemetery. A silence so profound, it was as if time itself had stopped. I stood frozen in the center of the graveyard, my body unmoving, my mind spinning, caught between the reality of what had happened and the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. I was no longer just a bystander in this cursed place. I was a part of it now, bound to the earth beneath my feet, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. The ground beneath me still pulsed with unnatural energy, the stone I had uncovered continuing to glow faintly in the shadows. The figures, the guests who had never checked out, now walked silently around me, their hollow eyes locked onto mine, their presence a suffocating weight. They had no faces, only shadows, but their movements were deliberate, as if they were aware of something I couldn't comprehend. I could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on me, growing stronger with every second. The cemetery wasn't just a place where the dead rested, it was a prison for those who had never left. And now, I had become one of them. I tried to move, to break free, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the earth had claimed me, its roots wrapping around my body, binding me to the cemetery. My breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like it was the last. The figure, the one who had risen from the grave, stepped closer, its presence filling the air with an almost tangible darkness. "You cannot leave." The words echoed in my mind, deep and resonant, like a command rather than a statement. "You belong here now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But my body felt as though it had been taken over by something older, something beyond my understanding. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, stared at me, unblinking, as if it knew every thought in my head. It knew my fear. It knew my desperation. "You are part of the cemetery now." The air grew colder, the temperature dropping as if the graveyard itself was exhaling a breath of death. The voices of the dead rose again, their whispers louder, more insistent. They spoke not with words, but with a presence that filled my soul, a presence that demanded I join them, join the earth, join the endless cycle of the cemetery. But then something changed. A flicker of recognition, a memory from before I had touched the stone, flashed in my mind. I had once been free. I had once been alive. I had made the decision to become a grave digger because I needed the work. But now I wasn't just doing a job. I was living in a place where time had no meaning, where the dead never truly left. I tried again to move, to break free, but the energy from the earth surged through me, taking hold of every fiber of my being. The cemetery was not just a place for the dead. It was a place that consumed everything in its path. The living, the dead, it didn't matter. The cemetery had no boundaries, no rules. I looked around, but there was no escape. The graves, once just symbols of the past, were now alive, pulsating with the same dark energy that surrounded me. The shadows of the guests swirled in the air, their forms flickering like a bad memory, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth opening up, inviting me to join them. And then, for the first time, I heard it clearly. Voices, not just whispering but speaking in unison. A single word that echoed through the cemetery, through the very earth itself. "Welcome." I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness, my body swallowed by the earth. The dead had claimed me, just as they had claimed the others who had never checked out. I was no longer a grave digger, I was one of them, one of the forgotten souls bound to this cursed place forever. The stone that had once called to me, that had drawn me into this nightmare, pulsed again, its glow intensifying, wrapping around me like a shroud. The earth beneath me gave way, and I felt myself sinking deeper into the ground, into the darkness, where the dead roamed and time stood still. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was part of the cemetery now, my soul tangled in its roots. The figures that had once walked among the graves now surrounded me, their cold hands reaching out to guide me into the earth. "You'll never leave," they whispered in unison. "None of us ever do." The ground swallowed me whole, the darkness closing in around me, and I knew in that moment, with an unshakable certainty, that the cemetery had claimed me. I was not free. I was not alive. I was one of the lost souls, forever bound to the earth, forever part of the cemetery.